Have you ever been on a trip, like maybe you're standing in front of this just breathtaking mountain range?
Or like a really incredible, violent sunset.
Yeah, exactly. A sunset. And you pull out your phone, to take a picture. You frame it up perfectly, snap the photo, and then you look down at the screen.
And it's never the same.
Right. The image is there, the colors are fine, the pixels are doing their job, rendering the light. But somehow, it's just dead.
Completely dead.
The actual living reality of that moment, the wind on your face, the sheer scale of the landscape, that feeling of your own smallness, all of that is just completely missing from that little digital rectangle.
It's a really common feeling, actually.
Yeah, and that exact feeling of the photo being dead is what the 20th century French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy calls the trap of representation.
Which is really the core of what we're talking about today.
Exactly. We're going to spend this deep dive basically tearing down a 2,000-year-old philosophical wall.
The very stubborn wall. Seriously. The wall that separates us from actual breathing presence. We're looking at a pretty towering, notoriously dense collection of his essays from 1993.
Right. It's called The Birth to Presence.
Right. And our mission today is to cut through all the academic thicket. We want to reveal this radical, totally life-altering way of thinking about your own existence, about community, and, what it means to just simply be.
And honestly, it is a journey that requires us to leave a massive amount of philosophical baggage at the door.
Oh, for sure. We have to unlearn a lot.
Yeah. Jean-Luc Nancy operates as this kind of earthquake in the history of Western philosophy.
Setting the stage a bit, who exactly was he? Because he's writing in a very specific environment.
Right. So he was writing in this incredibly fertile intellectual environment of post-structuralism.
Which was dominated by some huge names.
Yeah, he was writing alongside heavyweights like Jacques Derrida. But they were doing different things.
Well, Derrida spent his career analyzing the structural trace of language, how texts deconstruct themselves. But Nancy took a slightly different path.
He went deeper into being itself.
Exactly. He was laser-focused on ontology, which is the actual nature of being.
Right.
And by the time these essays in The Birth to Presence were compiled, he was really at the height of his influence. He was forcing this complete rethinking of the bedrock of reality.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of that.
He
argues that basically since the days of Plato, we've been trapped.
Trapped in what he terms the epoch of representation.
The epoch of representation. Let's really unpack that phrase because it feels like the engine for everything else in the book.
It absolutely is.
When he says representation, he obviously doesn't just mean a painting on a wall or a political delegate in a government.
No. He means the fundamental obsession we have with freezing reality.
Like the photo of the sunset.
Exactly like the photo. It is the act of putting a border around something, defining it, and saying, this is what it is.
We capture it. We categorize it.
We delimit it. The operation of representation is essentially a demand for mastery.
Mastery over reality.
Right. A thinking subject looks out at a universe that is chaotic, inherently unrepresentable, and constantly in motion.
And they just force a limit onto it.
Yes. Nancy makes this argument that the Western thought is precisely what designates itself as limit, as demarcation.
Think about the universal planetary vocation of Western thought. It constantly wants to extend its own limits to capture and categorize absolutely everything.
Everything, from classifying biological species to mapping the human genome.
Or even algorithmically predicting consumer behavior today. It's all representation.
It's all trying to freeze the world into manageable data.
So if we think of existence as a violently flowing continuous river.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, representations like the act of walking up to the bank, taking a high-speed photograph of the water, printing it out, and then spending 2 millennia studying the photograph.
Arguing about the photograph.
Right, arguing about it, all while pretending that the glossy paper is the river.
While the actual river is rushing by.
Exactly. So Nancy's idea of presence, on the other hand, is the actual continuous flowing of the water itself.
The river analogy gets us halfway there, but honestly, Nancy would argue it's even more intimate than that.
More intimate how?
You aren't just standing on the bank taking a photo. You are the water itself trying to conceptualize its own wetness.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, representation requires distance. It cuts out a form or a shape upon the foundation of reality.
But you can't be distant from your own existence.
Exactly. True presence cannot be captured by pulling away and cutting out a shape. This is why Nancy is so deeply meticulous with his language in this book.
Right. Specifically, his use of the words coming and birth. They show up constantly.
Constantly. In these essays, he insists that presence is never a fixed, stable thing. It isn't a platonic idea just sitting in some perfect, unchanging realm waiting to be discovered.
So it's an action.
Yes, presence is a coming. Grammatically, it is not having come, like some event that is finished and in the past.
It's not a done deal.
No, it is the active, continuous action of arriving.
He actually writes, let me think. Presence is what is born and does not cease being born.
It's an event that never stops happening.
Right. Even the title of the book, The Birth to Presence, worked on 2 levels.
How so?
Well, it is the birth that brings us into presence, like physically being born. But it's also the birth that presence itself is constantly undergoing. It never settles into a final, knowable state.
It's a really beautiful way to think about it.
It is, but wait, let me push back a little here.
Go for it.
If being is constantly being born, if it is always arriving and can never, ever be captured or represented by our thoughts or our words,
Yeah.
how is this not just mysticism?
The mysticism critique.
Well, yeah. Doesn't that just mean existence is this totally ineffable, magical realm that we can't even speak about?
Yeah.
Because if we literally can't represent it, how are we sitting here debating it right now?
You are pulling on the exact tension that drives Nancy's entire project.
Okay, so how does he solve it?
He fundamentally refuses to throw his hands up and surrender to mysticism or negative theology.
He doesn't want to say it's magic.
No, he doesn't want to say existence is magical at all. He wants to say it is deeply, roughly material.
Material, like physical.
Yes. And to solve the problem of how to talk about the unrepresentable, he introduces this concept of exscription.
Exscription, so the opposite of inscription.
Exactly. Think about what inscription is. When you inscribe something, you write it down.
You force it into the limits of language and grammar. You capture it.
Right. Exscription, though, is the process by which sense is written outside itself.
Outside itself.
It is the trace left on the very limits of our language. When we speak, the words point to a reality that our categories fundamentally fail to contain.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Think of the physical act of writing a word on a page. The ink, the paper, the physical movement of your hand, all of that is the rough reality of existence actually happening.
The materiality of it.
Right. But the meaning of the word tries to ignore that physical reality to point to an abstract concept.
Oh, I see. The meaning wants to pretend the ink isn't there.
Exactly. Exscription is Nancy's way of forcing us to look at the edge where language runs out of steam.
Where it bumps up against reality.
Right. He acknowledges that to be born is the name of being, but immediately clarifies that it is precisely not a name.
Because it's an action.
It's an action. It's the ink hitting the page, not the definition in the dictionary.
Okay, that makes sense.
Huh.
But if our foundational philosophical systems have been staring at a photograph of a river instead of swimming in it for this long,
A very long time, yeah.
how did the greatest system builders in history miss the water? Which brings us to Nancy's huge confrontation with Hegel.
Oh, Hegel. You can't talk about Nancy without talking about his dismantling of Hegel.
Right, because Hegel basically wrote the instruction manual for Western identity.
He really did. He believed human identity is defined by what he called indifferent identity.
Let's look at the mechanics of what Hegel actually thought made us human. Because it's wild how much we still believe this today.
Right. In Hegel's massive architectural system, the thing that elevates a human being above nature is self-consciousness.
The
A pure, self-contained unity of the I. For Hegel, the subject is a closed loop. Identity pulls itself together, and in doing so, it aggressively opposes itself to everything else.
It opposes itself to difference.
Yes. It assumes difference, absorbs it, and establishes itself as this dominant, waking subject that can master its environment.
So for Hegel, this self-conscious, wide-awake I is the absolute pinnacle of existence.
The ultimate goal. Total mastery and total consciousness.
But Nancy looks for the cracks in that armor.
He always does.
And he goes straight to the margins of Hegel's works, specifically the Encyclopedia. He looked at what Hegel wrote about sleep and hypnosis.
Which is such a brilliant move because sleep is a huge problem for Hegel's system.
How did Hegel treat sleep?
Hegel treats sleep as a mere preliminary phase. In his view, the true subject is immortal, unengendered, and essentially an insomniac.
The insomniac.
Right, because sleep is just this dark, primitive background from which the glorious conscious I awakens.
Yeah.
You basically have to outgrow sleep to become an adult subject.
But Nancy pauses here and completely subverts the hierarchy.
He turns it entirely upside down.
He argues that this sleep, this passivity, this vulnerable state before the I confidently asserts itself, that is actually our foundational permanent state.
Yes, and he uses this really powerful analogy that Hegel himself struggled with.
The child in the womb.
Right. Hegel actually described the womb state as a magical relationship because he couldn't quite fit it into his rigid system of the isolated, self-conscious I.
Because a fetus isn't walking around asserting dominance over nature.
Exactly. Nancy seizes on this anomaly. The child in the womb is not a fully formed identity making conscious choices.
It is, in Nancy's words, individuality without identity.
It is completely passive. It is just receiving, just being affected.
And Nancy uses this incredibly evocative, fragile phrase translated from the German. He says the child is trembled through by the mother.
Trembled through. That phrase is the mechanical core of Nancy's argument here.
It's such a striking image.
It really is. In Hegel's mind, you must conquer this womb state, right? You must overcome this trembling passivity to forge a real identity.
But for Nancy,
this trembling is not a deficiency. It is not a temporary weakness that you grow out of.
it gets the very condition of identity itself.
You cannot have an identity without this prior state of being completely exposed, completely affected by another.
We are always trembling because we are always, at our core, exposed to the world and to others,
As Nancy writes, to be born is to find ourselves exposed.
which completely obliterates the idea of the I as a fortress. We aren't these isolated, triumphant, armored subjects walking through the world.
The I is porous. We are inherently vulnerable, inherently tied to the other from the very first moment of our existence.
We are born trembling.
And if our foundational state is this trembling vulnerability, think about what that does to philosophy.
It breaks everything.
What happens to the massive philosophical safety nets we've built? If we aren't masterful subjects controlling our destiny, what happens to the grand guarantees of the universe?
Like God or truth or the ultimate good, they collapse.
They absolutely collapse.
Which leads us to one of the most striking concepts in the text.
Yeah.
The idea that our existence is fundamentally abandoned.
Abandoned being.
When I first read this, it sounded incredibly bleak, to be honest. But there's a strange sort of liberation in how Nancy mechanizes it.
It's not a pessimistic abandonment.
Right. He traces the etymology of the word abandonment back to the Latin root, bandon.
Which means an order, a prescription, or a decree.
So it is a highly specific, almost paradoxical legal state. When you are abandoned to a law.
But Nancy argues that the law we are abandoned to prescribes absolutely nothing except abandonment itself.
We are ordered to be without orders.
Exactly. The great transcendentals of the Western tradition, the one, the true, the good, these grand narratives that justify suffering or guarantee meaning.
They've all suspended their power over us.
They have withdrawn. Being itself speaks as abandoned by all these comforting categories.
To really hammer this home, Nancy brings in the biblical phrase "Ecce homo," behold the man, and ties it to Christ's cry on the cross.
Why have you abandoned me?
Right. Now, we have to be extremely clear here for anyone listening who might interpret this religiously.
Nancy is not doing theology. Far from it.
Right. He is making a strictly ontological point here.
The cry, why have you abandoned me, is the ultimate cry of existence exposed to its own dereliction.
It is the voice of the human being waking up to the realization that there is no grand safety net.
There is no ultimate metaphysical category that is going to swoop in and justify everything.
The time of abandonment is the time of a voice that just declares, behold the man.
It is an imperative ordering us to see existence exactly as it is, naked, finite, and without a foundational guarantee.
And to really ground this in a historical, physical moment, Nancy writes this whole essay titled De Paralysis Progressiva.
Focusing on Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the story here is just wild. In January 1889, in Turin, Italy, Nietzsche famously witnesses a horse being flogged in the street.
A very famous historical event.
He runs over, throws his arms around the horse's neck, weeping, and basically collapses into a madness from which he never recovers.
And usually historians and biographers treat this as just a tragic medical collapse of a brilliant mind, syphilis or whatever.
But Nancy demands we read it as a philosophical event.
For Nancy, Nietzsche's breakdown is the physical, bodily manifestation of the progressive paralysis of God himself.
Think about the historical context, right? 1889 is the absolute apex of European industrial and philosophical hubris.
The West really believes it has conquered meaning.
And here's Nietzsche, the philosopher who famously diagnosed the death of God, physically collapsing under the weight of a universe without that transcendental guarantee.
The epoch of representation physically breaks down in Turin. The ultimate guarantor of meaning is paralyzed.
But here's the thing. If God is paralyzed and we are abandoned, how do we avoid falling into the exact same madness as Nietzsche?
Right. How do we live with that?
Yeah, how is this not just a recipe for pure, paralyzing nihilism? Because Nancy doesn't want us mourning the loss of meaning in the streets.
No, he points us toward joy, specifically looking at the poet Hölderlin and his character Hyperion.
Hyperion is a survivor.
He is. He has lived through war, through lost love, through the complete collapse of the philosophical systems he believed in.
He has effectively outlived his own world.
Exactly. What Nancy finds fascinating is that Hyperion doesn't wallow in tragedy. He finds a profound joy in this desolate state.
But we have to understand the mechanics of this joy, because it's not the normal kind.
No, it is not the joy of possessing something, like acquiring a new truth to replace the old one. It is a joy in mourning.
A joy in mourning.
It is the affirmation of finitude itself.
How do you find joy in finitude? That sounds like an oxymoron.
By realizing that dissolution isn't a tragedy you have to cry over, it is a necessity that you must actively affirm.
Yeah.
The joy is knowing that existence passes, that it is limited, that it is infinitely finite.
So when you stop demanding that the universe provide an eternal, unchanging meaning.
The sheer fleeting happening of the present moment becomes intensely joyful.
Okay, wait. If we are completely abandoned and all the big meanings of history are paralyzed and all we have is this fleeting joy of passing away,
Yeah.
how on earth do I make a choice when I wake up tomorrow?
That is the big question.
If there is no true or good to guide my actions, how do we act in the world? If we aren't making choices based on a grand system, what actually is a decision?
That exact dilemma pushes Nancy into a really deep engagement with Martin Heidegger.
Trying to redefine what decision actually means.
Redefining decision and history without relying on an overarching system. In his essay, The Decision of Existence, Nancy tackles Heidegger's framework to completely rewire our understanding of human agency.
Because normally when we think of a decision, we think of it very mechanistically.
Right. I, the conscious waking subject, look at the options before me.
I weigh the pros and cons based on my internal values, and I choose the chicken over the fish.
Exactly. It is a subjective action that I initiate.
But Nancy says that is entirely wrong.
Completely wrong. Nancy argues that a true philosophical decision is not an action performed by a subject.
Then what is it?
It is an event that happens to existence.
It happens to us.
Yes, Heidegger uses specific terminology like decisiveness, which he frames as the opening up of existence to its own possibilities.
But Nancy pushes this further.
He clarifies that thought doesn't decide to act by consulting a theoretical rulebook. A true decision is an exposure.
And exposure.
It is in the moment when thought abandons itself to its own opening. It is an event of existence reaching its own decision.
I have to admit, that sounds like a bit of a contradiction.
How so?
If the subject isn't making the decision, if the event is deciding me, doesn't that just obliterate free will? Are we just passive observers watching decisions happen to us?
It definitely looks like a contradiction until you separate the idea of agency from the idea of that isolated, masterful I we talked about earlier.
The Hegelian I.
Right. Nancy isn't saying you are a robot.
Okay, good.
He is saying that the context of your existence, your inherent connection to others, and the historical moment you are in all coalesce into an opening.
You don't stand outside reality and manipulate it like a puppet master.
Exactly. You are immersed in it. The decision is the act of stepping fully into that exposure, rather than pretending you are a detached commander.
And this really rewrites how we have to view history, too. Nancy calls his version finite history.
Finite history, which is very different from how we usually think about time.
Right. Usually we think of time and history as a flowing river of successions. Event A causes event B, marching forward on a timeline.
Towards some ultimate goal.
Whether that's absolute freedom, technological utopia, or even the apocalypse.
But Nancy says time isn't just a sequence of dominoes falling. Time is a spacing.
A spacing. He uses the French word espacement.
Yes, espacement. Time is an opening that creates room for things to happen.
The mechanics of espacement are notoriously tricky, I think, but they are vital.
They are. Nancy is arguing that happening doesn't occur in time, as if time were an empty bucket we just drop events into.
Right.
Happening is what occurs between presents. The spacing is the literal opening of a gap within time that allows presence to emerge.
I always think of a piece of music when I try to understand this.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy.
Because the music isn't just the sequence of the notes. If you hit every key on a piano at the exact same time, Or if you play all the notes in a symphony with 0 breaks,
You don't get music.
you get a terrifying wall of noise. The music is actually defined by the silence. It is the literal spacing between the notes that creates the rhythm, the melody, the feeling. Without the interval between the sounds, the song literally cannot exist.
That's beautifully put. Nancy is saying that being itself is this spaciousness. It's the gap that allows existence to present itself without collapsing into a solid, unmoving block.
The spacing is the condition for anything to appear at all.
And this isn't just abstract physics, it has massive, tangible political stakes.
Which Nancy brings up when he talks about the we of history.
Right. Because time is just this spacing, and because we are abandoned without any grand transcendentals to guide us, history has no master plan.
There is no Hegelian monarch, as Nancy puts it, who can speak for all of humanity and dictate the final goal of history.
There is no script. We don't form a single unified block of humanity marching in lockstep.
Which is what totalitarianism tries to enforce.
Exactly. Instead, we exist in what Nancy calls a togetherness of otherness.
A togetherness of otherness.
We are a collection of singularities exposed to each other in this spacing. Because of this, we must decide to write history ourselves.
But we don't write it by enforcing a new master plan or a new totalitarian vision.
No, we write history by exposing ourselves to the present. We write it by stepping into the gap, acknowledging our shared finitude and the sheer fact of our exposure to one another.
Okay, so we have dismantled the traditional Western mind.
Yes.
We have dismantled the rigid identity of the isolated subject.
Yeah.
And we have dismantled the grand progressive march of history.
We've dismantled a lot.
We are abandoned, we are trembling, and we exist in the spacing of time. But, and this is a big but, how does this abstract birth to presence actually manifest in the physical, messy world we live in?
That is the logical next step.
If we aren't these rigid subjects, what are we physically? This transitions us perfectly into how Nancy explores the physical forms of existence.
Right, starting with our bodies, our voices, and our fragments.
In the essay simply titled Corpus, Nancy targets the physical body.
And in the grand tradition of Western philosophy, the body is almost always treated as a secondary vessel.
Like Plato's cave, where the physical bodies and objects are just degraded shadows of the real, perfect forms.
Or think of the Christian concept of the glorious body, which treats the physical form as a symbol of God's majesty.
The body is always treated as symbolizing something else.
Something supposedly higher or more real, like the rational mind or the eternal soul.
And Nancy forcefully rejects that.
Completely. For him, the body exceeds signification.
It cannot be reduced to a meaning, a text, or a symbol.
He writes, "A corpus is not a discourse. However, what we need here is a corpus. The body is not there to be read like a book and decoded.
Instead, the body is the site of what he calls the aesthetic trance of pleasure and birth.
The mechanics here are so fascinating. When you experience intense physical pleasure or physical pain, or the sheer visceral reality of being born,
You are not processing a logical argument.
the body in those moments isn't pointing to a higher meaning. It is the rough materiality of presence happening right there.
It is the uncontainable coming into being of existence that bypasses representation entirely. You just feel it.
You just are it. And he applies this exact same logic to the human voice.
In an essay titled Vox Clemens in Deserto, right? Which means a voice crying in the wilderness.
Yes, usually we think of the voice as a utilitarian tool.
Like, I am a fully formed subject, I generate a thought in my brain, and I use my vocal cords like a hammer to project that thought across the room into your brain.
But Nancy argues that the voice is actually an energy that calls the subject into being.
So the voice comes first.
In a way, yes. Before you speak, the I doesn't fully exist in that space as a concrete presence.
The voice isn't just a vehicle transmitting a pre-existing message.
The physical, material act of voicing is the emergence of the subject. The energy of the voice precedes the identity.
He actually quotes the poet Paul Valery here. He describes the voice as a heightened state, tonic, tensed, consisting of pure energy.
The voice physically exceeds our attempts to control it with grammar.
Now, that loss of control, that sudden subversion of logic and meaning, isn't just restricted to profound things like pain or a voice crying in the wilderness.
No, Nancy takes this concept into a really surprising arena.
Humor.
Yes. In the essay Menstruum Universal, he analyzes Sigmund Freud and the mechanics of jokes.
Specifically, the German word Witz. Why is a high-level ontologist dedicating time to dissecting jokes?
Because a joke is the perfect everyday example of an uncontrolled birth of meaning.
Think about the mechanical structure of a joke. The setup creates a representation,
It builds a logical, expected scenario in your mind.
but the punchline shatters that representation by revealing a hidden, inscribed meaning.
Often through a pun or a sudden leap in logic.
And it forces a physical reaction, laughter.
And laughter bypasses rational deduction entirely. You don't deduce a joke, it hits you.
Exactly. If you have to explain the joke, it's dead.
Nancy argues that traditional philosophy has always tried to exclude jokes, to exclude wits, because philosophy's ultimate goal is to control discourse with reason and logic.
And a joke fundamentally cannot be controlled.
It is a sudden, joyous dissolution of rigid identity and stable meaning. The body laughing is the body rejecting the epoch of representation.
So jokes shatter the system. But, we don't just communicate in jokes.
Right.
What happens to the rest of our discourse when the system shatters? Nancy addresses this in a dialogue with his colleague, Philippe Le Barthes.
About the concept of the fragment.
The essay is called Ne me frangere,
Yeah.
which translates to Don't Shatter Me.
Philosophers have this long, exhausting history of trying to build massive, totalizing systems that explain absolutely everything.
Hegel again.
Always Hegel. But the fragment is the natural enemy of the system.
A fragment is incomplete by nature.
It implies a whole that is either lost or impossible to achieve.
In their debate, Le Barthes and Nancy argue that the plea Ne me frangere reveals the ultimate fragility of human discourse.
We do not speak in perfect, complete systems.
We speak in fragments, in incomplete thoughts, in sudden bursts of energy.
The fragment actively resists the totalitarian urge to force everything into one unified block of meaning.
It reveals that our speech is fundamentally fragile, and that this fragility is actually our default state.
Which naturally raises a massive problem.
It really does. If our bodies exceed meaning, if our voices act before we are fully formed subjects, if our jokes bypass logic, and if our thoughts are just fragile, incomplete fragments.
How do we ever truly communicate with each other?
Exactly. Are we just isolated monads shouting fragments into the void?
This brings us to one of the most beautiful and poignant mechanical explanations in Nancy's philosophy, the concept of the interval.
The interval. He tackles this in the essay Speaking Without Being Able To, which is a co-authored dialogue with the translator Anne Smock.
The setup for this dialogue is brilliant because it starts with a literal paradox.
Nancy says to Smock, I must speak to you, but I don't know who you are.
He explains that the word you is just the I of an utterance addressed to him.
He is speaking, he is aiming words across a chasm, but he realizes the impossibility of ever fully, completely grasping the inner identity of the person he is speaking to.
He is hitting his representation of her, not her actual presence.
And this is where the interval becomes crucial.
Because we are separate, finite beings, because we are not fused together into one giant telepathic mind communication, always contains a tiny bit of disappointment.
The subject of an utterance never perfectly, seamlessly comes into touch with another subject.
The message is never received with 100% fidelity. There's always a gap, a slippage of meaning.
But Nancy insists this is absolutely not a failure of communication.
Not at all.
The gap is the only reason we can even have a dynamic.
Precisely. The interval, the literal space and difference between you and I, is the very thing that makes speech both possible and necessary.
If there were no interval, if we were perfectly fused into one entity, we wouldn't need language.
There would be no together and no apart.
By speaking, we aren't just transmitting data points. We are actively designating this interval.
We are pointing to the reality of our shared separation. The act of speech designates our togetherness.
Every time we talk, even if we completely misunderstand each other, the sheer act of aiming a word across the chasm is a celebration of the fact that we share a space.
We are, as Nancy says, dividing between us the scant being of the interval.
This struggle with meaning and the exasperation of communication is exactly why Nancy turns to the writer Georges Bataille.
In the essay, Reasons to Read,
Bataille was a thinker who constantly aggressively fought what Nancy calls the burden of signification.
Bataille didn't want his writing to be consumed as easy, digestible meaning.
Nancy actually notes that reading Bataille is an exasperation. It frustrates the reader because Bataille forces you to confront the reality that meaning is inscribed, written outside itself.
Bataille is always stealing away from neat academic discourse. He refuses to let his text be frozen into a representation.
Nancy even notes that Bataille's death acts as this implacable counterblow to anyone trying to retroactively turn his chaotic life into a neat little package of meaning.
And Nancy finds this same dynamic in visual art, too.
Right, in an essay about the contemporary paintings of Francois Martin.
Nancy argues that a true painting doesn't merely represent a presence that is sitting somewhere else.
It's not the high-speed photograph of the river.
Exactly. The painting is the presentation of presence itself coming into being.
It is the material reality of the paint, the stroke, the thickness of the color happening right in front of you.
It is the birth to presence occurring physically on the canvas, entirely separate from whatever object the painting might nominally resemble.
Okay, so we have covered a massive amount of philosophical ground.
We really have.
Yeah.
Tracing Nancy's deconstruction from Hegel's logic all the way down to the physical stroke of a paintbrush.
Nancy has provided a breathtakingly radical framework for understanding our bodies, our history, and the spaces between us.
But this level of radical deconstruction doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right. The philosophical world reacted, and they found significant blind spots in his work.
Let's look at a major critical review published in the Review of Metaphysics
By Leslie Armour and Susie Johnston. They were extremely thorough in identifying both Nancy's triumphs and where his framework starts to buckle.
On the positive side, they correctly identified that Nancy successfully dismantles the Hegelian totalitarian state.
Because by proving that history has no grand overarching idea, Nancy destroys the philosophical justification for a single monarch, dictator, or state apparatus to speak for all of humanity.
He also provides a robust alternative to modern liberal individualism.
By showing that we are always already trembling and inherently exposed to each other.
He proves we aren't just isolated atoms floating around in a free market looking out for our own self-interest.
He provides a totally new understanding of community based not on national identity or shared goals, but on shared finitude and the mutual spacing we inhabit.
However, Armour and Johnston issue a major critique regarding Eurocentrism.
This is a big one. In the introduction to the book, Nancy makes this sweeping, almost casual claim that the East, or the other world, is merely an effective representation created by the West.
The critics rightly jump on this. They ask, is this just a new, sophisticated form of Western colonialism of thought?
Nancy is claiming that the whole world is trapped in the Western epoch of representation. But what about, for example, Chinese Neo-Confucianism?
It is a critical limitation of the text.
Because Chinese rationalist idealist traditions do not obsess over representation or presence in the way Plato or Hegel did.
Their foundational texts focus heavily on the concept of order and harmony rather than capturing the ontology of being.
Nancy's brilliant deconstruction, as radical as it is, remains entirely trapped within the Western canon.
He uses Hegel, Heidegger, and Nietzsche to tear down the house that Plato built. But he rarely steps outside that neighborhood to see if other houses operate on different physics.
He hints at other ways of engaging reality, but he doesn't develop them. His horizon is distinctly, inescapably European.
Another fascinating point of friction the critics highlight is Nancy's profound clash with Emmanuel Levinas.
Another absolute giant of 20th century French philosophy.
Levinas is famous for his ethics, which are based entirely on the infinite nature of the other.
For Levinas, when you look at the face of the other, another human being, you encounter an infinity that you cannot possibly comprehend.
And because you cannot encompass them, this infinity commands you ethically. It commands you not to kill, to be responsible.
But Nancy aggressively rejects this insertion of infinity.
Nancy insists that we are infinitely finite.
Finitude doesn't mean we are just tiny, insignificant specks in a giant universe waiting to die.
It means we're infinitely exposed to our own physical limits and the limits of others.
For Nancy, bringing an infinite concept into the ethical equation is just smuggling God back into the picture.
It creates a deity that needs a place in the world that cannot be physically found.
This is a fundamental philosophical clash about mechanics. Does ethics require a transcendent infinite command? Or does it require radical, grounded acceptance of our shared physical limits?
Nancy bets entirely on the latter.
And then there's the most common complaint leveled against Nancy by frustrated readers everywhere, the accusation of mysticism.
The one we touched on earlier.
When you start throwing around phrases like the inexhaustible immanence of sense and the continuous birth of presence, it starts sounding a lot like negative theology.
It sounds like you were talking about a divine, magical force without using the word God.
Nancy was acutely aware of this critique, and he defended his methodology vigorously.
He insists repeatedly that he is pointing to the rough materiality of the world, not some spiritual beyond.
Yes, his vocabulary is intensely poetic. He talks about joy, birth, trembling, and coming, but he applies those words to the physical body.
To the vocal cords, to the actual measurable space between two people talking.
It is an ontology of the here and now, of the dirt and the flesh, not of the hereafter.
So what is the ultimate legacy of this dense, difficult, beautiful collection of essays?
Nancy didn't write a concrete political manifesto. You can't read The Birth to Presence and go form a political party based on trembling identity or Exscription.
But his work acts as a vital, philosophical immune response against totalitarianism.
That is precisely its greatest enduring strength.
By asserting that history is not a predetermined march that we must submit to, he frees human agency from the grand narratives that have caused so much suffering.
History is a spacing and opening a blank page.
We must actively decide to write it together, not by imposing a new system, but by acknowledging our shared abandonment and our shared responsibility to the present moment.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started. Remember that photo of the sunset on your phone?
The one that felt dead compared to the wind and the scale of the mountain?
We live in an era that is completely, overwhelmingly obsessed with capturing and representing everything.
We track our sleep data, our steps, our heart rates.
We take constant photos of our meals, our faces, our vacations. We build massive digital profiles, metrics, and algorithms.
We operate under this core, unexamined assumption that if we just gather enough data, if we can just snap a high enough resolution picture, we can finally know ourselves and our society perfectly.
We think we can master existence through representation.
But if Jean-Luc Nancy is right, that entire project is fundamentally flawed.
The mastery we seek is an illusion.
What if the very act of trying to freeze and represent our lives is exactly what alienates us from actually living them?
Think about that today. What if the truest part of you is precisely the part that can never be captured in a photo, defined in a bio, or uploaded to a server?
What if the core of your existence is the part that is endlessly, quietly, trembling, and being born?
Something for you to mull over the next time you reach for your camera.